In order to find the starting point for Chinese history, as opposed to prehistory, we need to find evidence of the first written down scripts. That's what is really the definition between prehistory and history. History is when we have some sort of script, some sort of documentary evidence to go upon. And in the case of Chinese history, it's actually quite unambiguous where the earliest scripts are. We can date them precisely to the year 1250 BC, a nice round number, on what are known as oracle bones. Oracle bones. So Chinese history really begins with the oracle bones in 1250 BC. And the amount of information that we have to work with that was written on these oracle bones is astounding. We have hundreds of thousands of fragments of these bones, tens of thousands of them have been transcribed and translated, and we can actually understand what were the people who were writing down the earliest surviving forms of the Chinese script. What were they talking about? What were their concerns? What were they doing with oracle bones? Fortunately, we actually know most of their names as well, the kings who were in power at that time period. The earliest king that we have an actual documentary eyewitness record of, we know his name. At least we know his name as it would be pronounced in Chinese today, the language and pronunciation, and what variety of the Chinese language family would have been spoken back then would have been quite different. In fact, it would have been mutually unintelligible in the same way that Old English is unintelligible to speakers of modern English, an important point to remember. King Wu Ding. We also know on many of the oracle bones, we have mention of one of his favorite consorts as well, a woman by the name of Lady Hao. So let's sort of use some of these oracle bones, the ones that mention King Wu Ding, his consort Lady Hao, to try to unpack some of the major themes of the earliest moments that we have attested to in the historical record. Now we can say really two major observations that are recorded that we can glean from these early oracle bones about some big themes in Chinese history. The first one is what the point of oracle bones really was. What were they doing with these sort of things? Because you might be thinking, wait a second, I've never heard of oracle bones being used in sort of recent history or Chinese history. Is this something that was continuous throughout 3,000 years of Chinese history? Well, no. In fact, it is unique only to this early period to be trying to communicate with the netherworld through bones, through script written on bones and divination with ancestors. So that's really our first major theme, is that divination is going on. The king is using these bones and a process of inscribing questions on them to try to communicate through lavish ritual ceremonies with various beings who are not in this world. They're in some sort of other world. And he's asking them questions. He's trying to understand what is harming certain aspects of my life. Why might the weather not be conducive to agriculture? Why does my tooth hurt? Which ancestor is responsible for this? And what we're seeing is sometimes in order to sort of placate certain ancestors or certain types of spirits who live in another world, various types of sacrifices are being offered. Now, sometimes the sacrifices are as simple as sheep, or it might be a certain type of resource that's going to be consumed and given up to the gods. Very shockingly, however, and this was a shock to many scholars in the 20th century when the oracle bones were actually excavated for the first time, one of the things that often gets sort of put up as a sacrifice are humans. There was human sacrifice going on at the time of the earliest oracle bones. Now, this is during the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty, if you want to have some dates here, about 1250 BC to 1050 BC. It may predate 1250 BC. It almost certainly predates 1250 BC. We don't know how far, however, because the appearance of writing sort of comes in right at 1250 BC. Undoubtedly, there's another 50, 100, maybe 200 years to the Shang dynasty, but nevertheless, all we have to go on is the last 200 years of this dynasty. We're located in what is today northern China, in the area of the eastern half of the Yellow River. All right, that's where the Shang dynasty and most of the early dynasties are all going to be based. So we see that there is ancestor worship. The king is sacrificing other live humans, sheep, in elaborate ceremonies in order to placate or meet the demands of certain ancestors, certain landscape gods. There is a hierarchy of gods. Scholars have actually gone through all these and been able to find out, who's the most powerful of these spirits in the other world, who's next, and who's sort of the least powerful, and what sort of concerns are addressed to them. And they've come up with the hierarchy of gods. It's very fascinating. At the very top is some sort of being simply named D, D-I, D. And D seems to be the most powerful god in the earliest historically attested Chinese state. Why is he the most powerful? Because it seems that he's beyond supplication. You don't find the king trying to placate D, trying to meet his demands. All the divinations that are directed towards D are simply trying to understand, is D responsible for a certain phenomenon? Because if he's responsible, there's very little we can do about it, because he's sort of beyond human intervention. All right, then there's like landscape gods, who seem to be the next level down. The mountain god, the river god, the earth god. Not quite as powerful as D, but still they have power over considerably important phenomenon, such as wind, rain, floods, sun, the sort of things that affect agriculture, and obviously the fortunes of a dynasty as well, and potential social unrest. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, still more powerful than living humans, but at the bottom of the otherworld hierarchy are more recent ancestors of the king's royal family. And we see him directly supplicating himself, asking, what is it that ancestor E, ancestress Jing, what does she need? Both women and men in this hierarchy. Why are they doing this, and how can we placate them? And it is believed that both the landscape gods and the recent ancestors can have sacrifices given to them, and they might be able to intervene in your life. Now, we also see, in addition to sort of the concerns of divination and whatnot, and the fact that human sacrifice is going on, we also know that gender views come in early on here as well. Why do we know that? Well, this is why I brought up Lady Hao's name. Lady Hao, you see, the reason that she comes in on some of these oracle bones, in one of them, we have a very fascinating divination in which the king is essentially asking, is Lady Hao's birth going to be good or bad? What is the definition of a good birth or a bad birth? You're thinking, oh, maybe that's just, is Lady Hao going to survive childbirth because it's very dangerous in this day and age? No, that's not what is the definition of a good or a bad birth. A good birth in this case would be a son. Unfortunately for Lady Hao, it ended up that she had a daughter, and the divination actually records the result. It says it was not an auspicious birth, it was a daughter. So, we're trying to think about continuities and discontinuities in early Chinese history versus later Chinese history. This is one of your first continuities, to be sure, is views towards gender. Some misogyny there. The idea that boys are better than girls. Some scholars actually speculate that this is perhaps why Lady Hao's tomb ended up being the only tomb from the Shang era that was unmolested by looters. All the other Shang kings, all of their tombs, ultimately were looted. And all that remained were their skeletons, and Lady Hao's tomb was the only one to be filled with all of her bronzes and everything that she wanted to take with her into the afterlife, because it was set aside from the major necropolis, the place where most of the favored royal aristocrats got their burials. She was excluded from that, even though she was once a favored consort. It is believed that perhaps giving birth to a daughter and not a potential male heir sort of demoted her, and that's perhaps why her tomb was separate from the others and then escaped the looters, fortunately for historians and archaeologists. Now, Lady Hao's tomb, because it was not looted in antiquity or even in the modern era, it actually shows us some other enduring themes of Chinese history. What was buried with the earliest Chinese corpses? Well, jade and bronzes. And we know that throughout 3,000 years of recorded Chinese history, these will be constants. Jade and bronze vessels will be the preeminent material commodities that signal prestige, wealth, and power of the elites. of all the political elites. And so when they went into the afterworld, they then oftentimes took tens, hundreds of pieces of jade and hundreds of bronze vessels. Very expensive. A huge amount of resources have to go in to bronze working in these early days as well. We'll see a little continuity with the jade in later dynasties, such as the Han Empire from 200 BC to 200 AD. We'll actually see some sort of full body suits in which a prominent corpse would be buried inside a suit of jade, sort of little small jade tablets sewn together, and then you have like a suit of armor essentially, but it's made out of jade. This idea that jade had almost magical properties was a symbol of the elite, and so sometimes bodies would be buried entirely within jade as well. What about the language? What do we know? Well, the script that we see on the oracle bones it represents what we might refer to as a Sinitic language. But it's important to understand that there's no such thing as a single Chinese language. This is often a misconception for people who haven't sort of had a specialized study of Chinese or Chinese history. There is a Chinese language family, which just like, Indo-European language families, Germanic language families, Romance language families, has many mutually unintelligible languages within it. And so there's huge diversity. This is clearly a Sinitic language, but both the language itself and the actual forms of the Chinese script are very different than anything that comes later. In fact, people who learn modern day Chinese today, such as Mandarin Chinese, based with the Beijing accent in the north, you can't read the oracle bones without specialized training. This is going to be similar for pretty much all scripts that have evolved over a 3,000-year period, but I do want to emphasize that. One continuity is that it's a recognizably Chinese script representing a Sinitic language. One discontinuity is that it's sort of like trying to read the original Anglo-Saxon Beowulf poem if all you know is modern-day English. You won't be able to make head or tail of it. This is why I always like to emphasize not only the continuities, jade, bronze, ancestor worship, but also the discontinuities. Human sacrifice, a very different script, a preeminent god who doesn't appear later on, D. We don't see D as the preeminent, most powerful god in later dynasties either. It's sort of like I often like to make the analogy that when we talk about ancient Rome, we often will use the word the Romans, the Roman Empire. We don't call them the ancient Italians. And I think I'd like to promote that sort of same label for China. I know for convenience sake, we refer to it as the ancient Chinese history, but really we need to come up with another term for this that recognizes that there is change over time, because it really is not just one indistinguishable dynasty after another. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's constant, significant change and continuity, as you might expect, throughout 3,000 years of Chinese history. Now we can see some of this already in the very next dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty, I like to use rough dates, not sort of get all too pedantic with really individual dates, because as a mnemonic device, that's not really going to be useful. Zhou dynasty, think roughly 300 years from 1050 to 750 BC. The Zhou dynasty will last longer than that, but this is when it has its preeminent era of influence and power. All right, the Zhou dynasty displaces the Shang, and they do some things that are very new. All right, they produce the first narratives of history and the first discourses of political legitimacy. All right, with the oracle bones, maybe other stuff was written down during the Shang dynasty. Maybe they had narratives of history and discourses of political legitimacy, but they didn't write it on the oracle bones, and all the other materials didn't survive. The Zhou are going to inscribe these things onto bronze vessels, so those will be very durable and they will survive. And some of the stuff that they write will be copied by later generations, so it survives in copies. Whereas the stuff from the Shang dynasty didn't, and we only recovered the oracle bones in the 20th century. So they weren't known for most of Chinese history that they were practicing really pretty gruesome human sacrifice in these earliest historical states as well. But the Zhou dynasty, they're going to have texts that survive. And these are narratives of history, right? They tell a story. It seems very disjointed and cryptic sometimes, but it is a story. And they're also going to produce a discourse of political legitimacy through these texts that justifies who belongs in power and who should not be in power. The oracle bones don't do anything like this. They're not trying to say the king should be in power because he is a just and moral ruler or he has a special relationship with D. You don't see that in the oracle bones. It's really a Q&A. back and forth. Question, what is the cause of this undesirable event or phenomenon? And hopefully a solution on how to solve it. That's all you get with the oracle bones, pretty much. The Zhou are going to produce, when I talk about a discourse of political legitimacy, I mean, this is where you get the concept of the mandate of heaven. Tian Ming, in modern day Chinese pronunciation, the mandate of heaven, in which it's basically said that a dynasty deserves to be in power and overthrow a previous dynasty when they have virtuous rulers. Now, the definition of virtue is quite nebulous, and many people will try to say virtue is one thing or another thing. But nevertheless, what you get, even though it's very vague, is that there is some sort of a sense that there are criteria for who deserves to be in power. It's not entirely might is right victory on the battlefield, although in practice it might be. You're starting to see a rhetorical gloss that accrues to people who are in power where they feel the need, ever so slightly, to create a story, a narrative, a moral story of why they deserve to be in power, why I deserve to be in power, and not you. All right? Now, one of the effects of this is we get what historians refer to as the dynastic cycle. It suggests a cyclical rise and fall of one dynasty after another, and these dynasties oftentimes will seem to be similar to each other in every single respect, except for the moral fiber of its rulers. The Zhou dynasty creation of this concept of mandate of heaven pretty much just says, that dynasties rise and fall. In the beginning, it's a virtuous, good ruler, and then they reach their peak, and then they experience a period of decline in which they are depraved, they are selfish, and that's when signals are sent from heaven, omens and portents that are determined that it's time to overthrow this immoral ruler who has lost his mandate. He has lost the mandate of heaven. And so everything seems to be the same, and in the histories of China that'll be written later by Chinese historians, they'll adopt this dynastic cycle historiographical framework, essentially, in which you're not really seeing any major material, fundamental shifts and changes in major themes in Chinese history. All dynasties, it's very personal. This was a good king, this was a pretty good king, this was an average king, this was a depraved king, and he lost the mandate. A more virtuous person came in and replaced him, and then the cycle starts all over again. This is responsible for this sort of one damn dynasty after another view of Chinese history, which again couldn't be further from the truth. All right, the dynastic cycle also conceals constant change. Already, and just from one dynasty to the next, the two earliest dynasties, the Shang and the Zhou, we've seen human sacrifices replaced with substitutes. You're not sacrificing human beings during the Zhou dynasty. Later on, the most famous substitute will be the terracotta warriors. That's the first emperor of the Qin Empire in 221 to 206 BC. When he dies, he has substitutes, clay terracotta warriors who go with him in the afterlife. He didn't kill tens of thousands of his own soldiers like the Shang dynasty may have done. We're already having human sacrifices already done with in just one dynasty, a couple hundred years. Oracle bones are not used again. They're replaced with what are known as milfoil stocks for divination. Suddenly we have literary text on history with poetry and songs that survive as well. We still have an evolving Chinese script. The script keeps changing as well. It looks different during the Zhou dynasty inscriptions than it did during the Shang dynasty. And we also have a change in the ultimate deity. Di is not the ultimate deity during Zhou times. They're not worshiping him. They're worshiping heaven. Tian, that's why the king is known as the son of heaven. And yet there are still some constants, and these will remain constants. Gender views, the gender hierarchy, the unequal gender hierarchy, a love of jade, a love of bronze, ancestor worship. Those are some constants. The last thing to note during the Zhou dynasty is, let's get some details on these literary texts, these narratives of histories, these things that purport to explain why the world is the way it is and how to make it harmonious if it is unharmonious. There are a couple of very famous ones. They're known as the Book of Documents, the Book of Changes, the Book of Rites, and the Book of Odes. If you're looking for one that you might actually want to read and you can still sort of stomach it, digest it today, it's going to be the Book of Odes. The Book of Odes contains about 1,000 now poems written down, but originally they would have been songs, in which we would have had both the poetry and you would have had music accompanying it, and oftentimes they'd be part of rituals. It's an eclectic mix. Sometimes they record what appear to be folk tales, sometimes they're solemn hymns from the ruling dynasty, but regardless, it is a treasure trove of fascinating poetry that is still accessible today. For our purposes, it's important to note that all of these texts, things that later generations will read, engage, rework, debate, those get created during the Zhou dynasty. Later on, these will be known as the Confucian classics because it will be believed that Confucius had a hand in editing them. Whatever you see in the Book of Documents is a direct result of Confucius's editing. He thought this was important, and therefore we have to parse this passage ad nauseum to understand what it means. All the later philosophers saw these books as containing all the knowledge that was worth knowing from the Golden Age. Anything that's worth knowing, it's contained in these texts that were created during the Zhou dynasty, because that's where our first stories came from. That's where our first narratives came from, and it's going to be the later Chinese philosophers who come in the era right after this, the second half of the first millennium BC, who are going to say, only I can impart the true wisdom of these ancient texts from the Golden Age of the Zhou dynasty. And that'll lead us into our next segment on the classical philosophers and the creation of the first empires.